Hello and welcome to this edition of Inside Judicial Watch. My name is Jerry Dunleavy and I'm your host. Today we will be discussing Fusion GPS, the investigative and opposition research firm that finds itself in the center of controversy in American politics today. Its role being hired by the Clinton campaign, the DNC, to dig up dirt on Donald Trump. Its hiring of Christopher Steele, who ended up producing what's now known as the Trump Dossier, which apparently was used by the FBI to launch various investigations into Donald Trump. Lots of controversy, and so I am here today with one of our senior investigators here at Judicial Watch, Bill Marshall. So thank you very much for joining me today, sir.
I'm happy to join you again.
So let me go through a little bit of your background, because it's actually quite relevant to a discussion about the sort of investigations in the investigative world of Fusion GPS. So before joining Judicial Watch, Bill spent 6 years at the DEA, 2 years at the Investigative Group International, doing mainly corporate investigations, was president of the North American investigations at Armor Group for 4 years, 10 years running a couple of your own investigative businesses, and then the last 5 years as investigator here at Judicial Watch. So he's very impressive. He knows his stuff. Why don't you talk with me a little bit, Bill, about sort of the investigation opposition research world, what your experiences were there, and kind of how that connects to what Fusion GPS was doing here.
Sure. As you say, my background kind of fits in an interesting way with this whole story. After I left the government in the 90s, I joined the Investigative Group International, IGI, which was in the late 90s hired, as you noted, by the Clinton administration to, just like today, dig up dirt on their political opponents. At that time, it was Monica Lewinsky, her family, her friends. It related to the fundraising scandals involving the Democratic National Committee, Al Gore and the Buddhist monks that were involved in fundraising, I believe, out in California, Charlie Tree. These are all sort of blasts from the past of the 90s, those of us who were following the news back then. And IGI, which was sort of coined as the secret police of the Clinton administration by some wags in the media, was heavily engaged in all that kind of work. And I happened to be there. I happened to join that firm right at the time that they were getting heavily involved in that for the DNC and the Clinton administration. Most of my work there focused on corporate investigative work that IGI was doing at the time. Although I did some oppo research for IGI, it was fairly minimal. My colleagues, on the other hand, were very heavily involved in that. In fact, the chairman of our company at the time, Terry Lenzner, had to testify in front of the Senate, just as the fusion principles are having to do today.
A lot of similarities.
A lot of similarities. In fact, two of my colleagues, Garrick Sway and Lauren Berger, two other senior investigators at IGI, had to also testify in front of the Senate about the investigative work that they were doing on behalf of the Clinton administration and the DNC at the time. So I sort of swam in that world all those years ago, and 20 years ago, and frankly, I didn't think I'd be here today doing essentially the same thing, but on the other side, looking at the investigators. So it's all come full circle, and it's interesting that the parallels that you're seeing now between the Clintons of the 90s employing private investigators, oppo research people, and the Clintons of today who are doing the same thing. Fusion GPS is sort of the IGI of the 2000 teens. The difference being, and I will say, to my knowledge, IGI never used a document like the Steele dossier, which essentially, in my view, is a fabrication. They did legitimate research. One can argue whether the targets of their research at the time, Monica Lewinsky's family and so forth, should have been targeted. I'm not obviously politically, I'm not on that end of the spectrum, but at least the information that they developed back then, to my knowledge, was all accurate. And I can't say the same for this document that Fusion produced.
So let's talk a little bit about that document and how it came to be. So Fusion GPS's involvement in all of this. I believe at first they were hired. I think it was revealed by the Free Beacon and that sort of thing in 2015 and early 2016 to do your more sort of standard opposition research and that sort of thing during the primaries. But after those were over, it was recently revealed that that's where the Clinton campaign, the DNC, came in. Talk with me about sort of the difference between your standard sort of opposition research and then what Fusion GPS ended up doing with the hiring of Christopher Steele and this dossier and that sort of thing.
Well, my recollection from reading Glenn Simpson's testimony, which I've to the Senate, which I've gone through very carefully, is that Christopher Steele was brought in, I believe, after Free Beacon's involvement ended. The Free Beacon, they were being funded by Paul Singer, who's a wealthy Republican hedge fund type guy in New York. Then after his involvement, the Free Beacon ended after the nomination of Mr. Trump as the Republican nominee. Then the whole Russian angle developed, right? Christopher Steele was brought in, and then then he was apparently a longtime associate of Glenn Simpson. They'd been working together, I believe, for something like 9 years, according to Simpson. Christopher Steele apparently had a good reputation when he was the head of the Russia desk at MI6. He had many contacts, as we're now discovering every day in the U.S. government. We're discovering more and more contacts, like in addition to the Department of Justice and the FBI, State Department now as well, we're learning. So he's brought in, and he produces, Glenn Simpson is very, very confident in the information that Chris Steele can produce based on his track record, I guess, and his reputation. Pretty shocking, actually, we can discuss this as we go into more detail about this dossier, but that Glenn Simpson, who, was a very well-regarded investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal for many years, would allow a document like this containing the allegations it does, which he admits he didn't corroborate, to go not only to the press, but to law enforcement agencies is truly, truly stunning. In my experience.
Right. So to talk with me a little bit. So Glenn Simpson is the founder and the head of Fusion GPS. Testified in front of the Senate, I think, back in August, and Senate Judiciary Committee back in August, and just recently hit that transcript, which had been private, was released. And talk with me a little bit about. Because you're referencing there the standard that a typical investigative firm should be following in terms of verifying information before passing it along. Talk with me, about kind of what we do here at Judicial Watch, what you do at a normal investigative firm, and how that differs from how they treated the dossier that Christopher Steele put together.
Absolutely, and not just at Judicial Watch. I would say, really, journalists. Especially those of Glenn's caliber when he was at the Wall Street Journal, typically double and triple source information before they put it out there.
Yeah.
Just as we're very careful. Judicial Watch, documents are our sort of staple of what we produce. We're not interviewing people. We're not relying on unnamed sources. As I say, typically, we rely on documentation, and all good investigative firms, high-end investigative firms, will also rely on documentation. Now, they may use human intelligence for lead purposes in order to, get information which they will then try to corroborate and support with documentation. But that's typically, these firms are being hired by corporations, either directly or through law firms, or they're hired by banks, insurance companies, those sorts of things. And they have to be able to go to court typically, and present documentation to make their case, whatever that may be. It is a stretch to rely, as they did in this dossier, entirely on human intelligence, especially when you're talking about Russia, which is a known adversary of the United States, and has a vested interest in creating as much turmoil in our society, in our political body, as they can. I mean, this endures to their advantage to have any kind of, what's been going on for the past year, for that matter, it must have them overjoyed in Moscow, what they have created, because I believe that this document is a piece of disinformation. I have no doubt about that. Much of it has been disproven. We know, based on, Michael Cohen's, allegedly traveled to, I believe, to Prague, but then it was proven through, a look at his passport records that he'd never been there.
Yeah.
So when even that most basic information hasn't been corroborated, you've got a serious problem. Not only does this call into question this particular so-called investigation by Glenn, by Fusion, it really calls into question all of their other work too. I mean, I would be, I'll tell you, we at IGI, I can tell you from my experience there, it did not help us when all of our work for the Democratic National Committee and the Clinton administration came to light. It was not. It did not help us in terms of our corporate business, because corporations don't like to see their investigators exposed. They don't like to see them, it's a very discreet business, as you would expect. It's something that's sort of, in the shadows. Most big corporations use them, but it's something that you don't want to bring a lot of publicity to.
Right. So, it's your contention, and there's a lot to it, that this is probably, at least to a large extent, a disinformation operation, and they were doing all sorts of things like that as well on social media, and all, hitting both angles. Basically, you're saying that this is what Russia likes to do. They like to try to cause controversy, and this is what they do.
Absolutely, and the document itself, is somewhat counterintuitive in the sense that you've got. You have Donald Trump meeting with Natalia Veselnitskaya at Trump Tower, all right, on June 9th, 2016. And yet, according to Chris Steele's dossier, he says, in terms of established operational liaison between the Trump team and the Kremlin, the emigre confirmed that an intelligence exchange had been running between them for at least 8 years. Okay, so the highly vaunted Chris Steele, former MI6 agent, is saying that the Trump and the Kremlin have had an ongoing intelligence exchange, a deep relationship for 8 years. Well, if that's the case, why is Donald Trump trying to get a meeting with some lawyer he's never heard of, some Russian lawyer that he's never heard of, who claims to have dirt on Hillary Clinton?
If there's been an ongoing relationship for a decade.
Exactly. None of it makes sense. It's sort of internally contradictory. And the FBI, by the way, had to consider that. That had to have occurred to them as well. So why are they using this? Apparently not just to launch an investigation, but to get a FISA warrant. That's a very big deal, because you are using the authorities and the technical capabilities of the United States government to spy on members of the opposing political parties' presidential campaign. That is truly stunning. This makes Watergate out to be, a Boy Scout jamboree. It's just nothing comes close, I don't think, in American history to what has happened here.
So, and let's dive in a little bit about what the dossier may have been used for. When James Comey testified in front of the Senate midway through 2017, he referred to the dossier as salacious and unverified. Right. Presumably, if it was salacious and unverified halfway through 2017, then it was salacious and unverified in 2016 when it was being used for a variety of things. If you can go through just kind of the various ways that the dossier may have been used, who was being handed to, who was referencing it, that sort of thing in 2016 and beyond.
Right. Well, we know that the dossier, this was in some ways, it was a terribly unsophisticated operation by the Clinton campaign and Fusion GPS. And in some ways it was unsophisticated, in some ways it was sophisticated. They channeled this dossier, right, through different channels to get it into the United States government. You have Bruce Orr meeting with, who was the former Deputy Assistant Attorney General, Assistant Deputy Attorney General, meeting, I believe, with Chris Steele, as I recall. You have Chris Steele's associate, a British national, meeting with David Kramer and John McCain to try to get to route the dossier into the FBI that way. That sort of gives it a veneer of respectability, because you have it coming from a foreign source, a Brit, being passed to a Republican senator who transmits it then to the FBI. So it sort of gives it this respectability it wouldn't otherwise have if it were coming through a more direct channel. And that's fairly clever. I don't want to give too much credit to the masterminds behind this thing, but and it flies in the face of some of the amateurishness of like the point I raised about the document claiming that there was this 8-year-long intelligence relationship between Trump and the Kremlin, and yet Donald Trump is meeting with somebody he doesn't know from Russia who claims to have damaging information about Hillary. So this is a story almost that Nelson DeMille couldn't write. I mean, this is so bizarre. This whole conspiracy, if you will, this whole cabal of actors who are just an interesting cast of characters. In between the Department of Justice, between the top people at the FBI, between Fusion GPS, and all their spouses, for some reason, many of them seem to be involved in this, in this story somehow too, which is in itself is an interesting kind of wrinkle.
Right. So, I mean, some of the questions that you'd want to know when it comes to the dossier is, was it used by the Obama administration to brief Congress? Was it used by the Obama administration to justify some level of surveillance? Was any of it leaked into media and news reports? And was the government involved in the funding of any of it?
Well, all great questions, and that's hopefully a lot of what we're going to be seeing in the coming days, as as the FBI is forced to turn over records to the House, in response to their subpoenas. But absolutely, I mean, has this piece of disinformation, I think, been used to secure a FISA warrant? That's critical importance. Was President Obama aware of all of this, since he was the head of government in 2016, and these issues go to the presidential campaign for his successor? I cannot imagine that he was not being informed of the FBI investigation, of the Trump campaign, of the allegations of collusion, the dossier and so forth. I mean, all of this really implicates the Obama administration as well, which makes it even more astonishing that you have, not only you have Hillary's campaign and Fusion and the media, which you alluded to as well, which is another sort of side of this story. While Chris Steele is communicating information with the FBI, he's simultaneously communicating this information to the media, right? And the FBI is giving, apparently, according to David Ignatius of the Washington Post, is giving sensitive information in return to Chris Steele, that being the identity of George Papadopoulos, right? Who they said was an informant within the Trump organization. The FBI is in effect compromising their own investigation by doing that. Now, I can tell you, as we've discussed, over the years that I was in that world, I would uncover in the course of my investigations, on occasion, evidence of crimes. I have turned that information over to the FBI, but only with the express knowledge and consent of my client, whoever that commercial client may have been, because doing otherwise, I could potentially open them up to civil liability, criminal exposure, right? You don't, when a client pays an investigator to research a topic, that investigator produces a product. That product is not the investigators, it's the clients. In this case, presumably Hillary Clinton's campaign. So,
because they were ultimately the ones funding Fusion GPS, who was then paying Christopher Steele. So ultimately, you're saying the dossier was being produced for who's paying for it, which was the Clinton campaign.
Clinton campaign,
DNC.
exactly. And now Glenn Simpson says in his testimony to the Senate committee that he did not seek anyone else's approval before turning this information over to the FBI via Chris Steele. That breach is, in my experience in that industry, best practices. You don't expose your client potentially to some kind of liability by turning over a document that belongs to them to a third party, whether it's the FBI or anybody else. It's just because as we've discussed, it has the danger of coming back and blowing up on the client. It's just a really shocking, all around. This whole story, in so many ways, shows really a stunning lack of professionalism, to be as generous as one can possibly be on the part of many people, and possibly criminality.
So you brought up 2 points there. The first being that it's extremely unusual, perhaps even unbelievable, that the information that was being gathered by Christopher Steele and Fusion GPS would be being shared with an organization like the FBI without the people who are ultimately paying for it, the Clinton campaign and DNC, having any idea or knowing about it. The second thing that you brought up was the flow of information when it comes to, if you're a private investigator and you uncover something and you hand it to the FBI. I mean, that's a fairly normal occurrence. But what you reference is that, which seems a bit irregular, is that the FBI coming back and confirming a piece of information, or at least saying that they're confirming it about a mole or that sort of thing. Information doesn't usually flow from the FBI to some private organization.
Yes, exactly. In my experience, the information when I dealt with the FBI was always a one-way street. It was my information going to them, not the other way around. And that's as it should be. Again, I say as having worked in federal law enforcement, albeit on the intelligence side, but with investigators on the enforcement side, you don't want to do anything that's going to compromise your investigation. So it's really another shocking example, but maybe not so shocking in light of everything else we're learning about the FBI under Comey's tenure, to see this kind of lack of professionalism. It's almost like they are working as colleagues, as though Christopher Steele has been deputized by the FBI. This is a foreign national working as a private intelligence collector on behalf of a political campaign, the political campaign of the U.S., the Democrat candidate for president of the United States, no less. This is uncharted territory, in my view, in terms of, witnessing a cabal of people trying to derail, including the president of the United States, the current president at that time, Barack Obama, working with the Democratic nominee to derail in my view, this is how it's shaping up to be, to derail the opposing presidential candidate's campaign, and then subsequently, I think, to impeach him is the ultimate goal, which would amount to a coup, in my view.
And the various ways that they did it, the different routes that you pointed out, getting into the hands of the FBI, briefing the media as well.
Yes, doing that simultaneously, and that, according to Glenn Simpson, that made the FBI go ballistic when they learned that Chris Steele was briefing the media. Well, they should have anticipated that, because who is this guy working for? They must have known that he was working for Hillary Clinton. And what did they expect, the outcome to be of Chris Steele's research and Glenn Simpson's research, but to damage Donald Trump via the media? It doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand where they were going, with what the end game was.
Right. Okay. So I think that we've pretty well covered a lot of the problems with the way that this was handled, the way that the FBI handled it, and that sort of thing. What direction is Judicial Watch going at this point in terms of trying to get more answers on that? Because I think that there's a lot that remains to be known. Fusion GPS's Senate testimony was, I believe that Glenn Simpson testified back in August in front of the Senate committee before the Clinton campaign's involvement was even known about. And I believe today that the House Intelligence Committee, who also interviewed Glenn Simpson, is going to agree to release the testimony. And that testimony occurred after, I believe, the Clinton campaign involvement was known. And so that'll be interesting to see what sort of questions and information arise from there. But what is Judicial Watch? What are we doing to try to get some answers here? What can we do, and what are we doing?
Well, we've launched a number of investigations into the individuals that were involved in the Trump dossier, for lack of a better word. For example, we've been trying to get communications out of the Department of Justice about Bruce Orr, his communications with Fusion GPS, with Christopher Steele, with Glenn Simpson, and so forth. We're trying to get information out of the DOJ, primarily communications regarding his wife Nellie Orr, who was working for Fusion GPS as a subcontractor. Another blatant conflict of interest, by the way, among the many that we see at the FBI in recent years. You have the Assistant Deputy Attorney General overseeing much of the apparatus involving the Trump investigation and the Hillary Clinton investigation and everything else. His wife working on behalf of Hillary Clinton effectively through Fusion GPS. You have Andrew McCabe, the Deputy Director of the FBI, his wife Jill McCabe receiving $700,000 from Terry McAuliffe and his organizations for her to run as a Democratic state Senate seat as a Democrat for the state Senate in Virginia, while Terry McAuliffe himself was under investigation by the FBI at DOJ for various and sundry things. So you have just a very, very almost unbelievable cast of characters in this whole saga. And what to my mind, what's almost equally surprising is that given the forces that were arrayed against Donald Trump, that he won, and that he won his election to begin, in the first place. This is such an egregious abuse of power, I believe, that's shaping up as more and more information is unearthed in this case than we've probably seen in this country, maybe in its history, in terms of politics, and political machinations. It's just really remarkable.
And it's easy to compare this to another investigation, which was the Clinton investigation that the FBI conducted. I mean, that's why it's so easy, because you're able to just basically take two things that were occurring at the same time and kind of see the seriousness versus perhaps not so serious way that the two investigations were treated.
It offers a wonderful, if I can use that word in quotes, contrast between, on the one hand, an individual who self-evidently broke so many laws in terms of her handling of classified information, talking about Hillary Clinton on her, her personal server, and the pay-for-play corruption at the Clinton Foundation, which we've documented very well here through Judicial Watch, as through our various FOIA requests and litigation and so forth. And going to the other extreme of launching an investigation against probably an innocent person, Donald Trump, regardless of what you think of him, based on fabricated information, or probably,
salacious and unverified, as the FBI
as
director said.
As FBI Director Comey said, salacious and unverified information, using that as the basis, is going to the other extreme. It almost makes you wonder if some kind of reorganization is not required of the FBI, because it's become so politicized and so corrupt.
But in the meantime, Judicial Watch, we have a lot of FOIA lawsuits, a lot of requests out.
We do, and if I could just add, and I don't mean to impugn. I have many friends at the FBI, agent level friends and relatives, okay, or working at the FBI, who I have the highest regard for. I'm sure 95% of them are terrific men and women trying to, they're patriots trying to do a good job. I'm talking about this elite level of politically motivated bureaucrats, who have at both DOJ and the FBI, who are involved in this really outrageous epic.
Yeah, and most of what we uncovered, I mean, again, is through emails that we've actually found and documents that we found, kind of showing these various biases, and again, like you said, the contrasts in the way that they dealt seriously with, the Trump-Russia investigation versus taking their foot off the gas to it, and a huge extent when it came to dealing with Clinton.
Right. You could almost use these, I would say, these cases as case studies in how an organization can become corrupt and dysfunctional. I mean, it's as I say, the best novelist in the world couldn't make this up, and it's going to take a serious effort by the government, a study to completely understand how all this happened. And I don't believe that things can continue on without major changes occurring at DOJ and the FBI.
Well, and as this continues, and as more information unfolds, and as Judicial Watch uncovers more, I do think I'll have to bring you back so that we can continue, because there's going to be more and more and more coming out, and so as this progresses, I'll have to bring you back to get your insights again. So
absolutely, and we're very fortunate here at Judicial Watch to be able to help expose this. I'm not sure there are many other organizations out there that are doing this kind of work to get these documents, and with the persistence and the litigation that we are. So.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Well, Bill, I do really appreciate you coming on. I think you helped shine some light on a lot of this. I appreciate your expertise there. And thank you all for joining us as well. You can guarantee that Judicial Watch is going to continue looking into this, continue uncovering more information. Until next time, I'm Jerry Dunleavy with Inside Judicial Watch.